Welcome to session 6, the violent versus the victims.
Good morning, Haley.
Good morning, Mako.
What are we talking about today?
We're talking about the violent versus the victims.
So last time we touched on how the institution of private property depends on violence. Apologists of the private property absolutist camp try to distance violence from that, but I just don't think it's possible. When we look at the origin of corporations, like the British East India Company, these are, first of all, legal entities that were deliberately designed to extract wealth, to make it less risky for the people who want to profit the most. And then they eventually ran India, right? I mean, they hired mercenaries and private security and basically ran India for the interests of the British investors. Like, this is what's going on.
So if you're going to go to somebody's house and take all their stuff and also tell them they can't leave and they work for you now, they're not going to like that, and you're going to have to do something to make them keep doing that.
Exactly. Yep. And so you hire Pinkerton. Oh, did I say?
What are you trying to say?
Well, at least in the North, like some of the earliest examples of policing was actually not for public safety or to defend the rights of citizens. It was to defend private property and to break up strikes.
Right. Right. I mean, it makes sense if it comes from a colonial background and all of your workers are people who really hate your guts, then you're going to need somebody with some big sticks to keep them in line.
Right, right. Because of sensitivities today about, well, I don't think we're anti-police, or we don't recognize, we can recognize when, folks who are in the police force are wanting to serve the community, wanting it to be, democratically controlled and accountable to the community. That's all great. But it's because we've come a long way. And it's important to notice that the institutional history contributes to why it is that even after George Floyd and all these terrible instances of citizen deaths at the hands of police, that we still have not been able to pass meaningful police reform. We can't get, because police departments are used to so much independence. They were, because they didn't come about really through elected officials designing what their goals and organization really should be. How policing as an institution came about in the US has to do with policing property rights and defending what people thought of as property. Slave patrols were the ones in the South, was the major influence in the South. Urban police in the North, and then Texas Rangers and frontier vigilantes in the West. And our part of our point last time was wage theft is so prevalent, but it's actually legal. Like it shouldn't happen. We keep trying to pass legislation against it, but it's actually legal because it serves the powerful. Meanwhile, did you notice, like, during COVID, there was all these videos taken of, quote, shoplifters. And often they were people of color. And this is what's happening in America's cities. Well, where do people go if they want to call security on wage theft?
Exactly. Right. And I think that's such a good point. I am under 5 feet tall. Most well-developed American adolescents could beat me up. I am one of the most vulnerable, able-bodied adult human beings walking around on planet Earth. So if someone hurts me, I kind of need some police to help because I can't really fight back. And that's just the reality of living the skin that I have. So I'm not anti-law. I'm not anti making sure that the law protects those who are vulnerable. I'm one of those people. I'm amongst, that's my life. But recognizing that an institution has a history that informs its present is something that we need to be brave about facing. There recently, I called the police because there was a car without a license plate that was parked in a place that wasn't supposed to be, and these parking spaces, there aren't that many. And so they're meant to be for the people who live here. And so I called because I was like, could you guys figure out where this car came from? Is it stolen? Does it belong to somebody else? I don't have the ability to check that out. And this, over 6 foot tall white police officer came and I had called. And so I obviously had done nothing wrong. And so I had a pleasant conversation in my front yard with him, but I was so glad that I got it on camera just in case. And he was uncomfortable because I was looking at him the eye and speaking to him like a human being and respectfully. And I
The
don't like
police
this.
officer.
Yeah, of course he's uncomfortable talking to me. I'm supposed to be the enemy. I know
Mhm.
that. I know he doesn't see that either. I know he's not thinking that in his head at the time, but I know that if you walk around with a particular skill set and a particular set of tools, then you are trained to use them. And if you walk around with a bulletproof vest and a gun, and you walk around with the training that tells you that some people are going to do some bad stuff and you're the guy that has to do it, then that's a job that you have. I am a therapist. I have that same dynamic. I am trained to get inside of people's heads, and I'm trained to do it well. And I am appropriately afraid of what damage I could do to society. And there is a board that is in authority over me to protect society from me. I get it. So we have to be brave about how we look at those who are meant to do good for society and their history.
Right. And to that point, like, we have a military that is headed up by a commander-in-chief who is a civilian.
Right.
Right. But it hasn't always been true, and it's not always true across the board, that there's a civilian who heads up local police departments. Sometimes
Right.
they're just a promotion from within.
Mm-hmm.
And this is part of what makes change so difficult. So Haley, you brought to my attention this quote back in 1845. There was a
Yeah.
letter from a former governor of South Carolina talking
Mm-hmm.
about basically a kind of the gun culture as he interpreted it. Can you read that?
Exactly. Yeah, I can. It says, with us, every citizen is concerned in the maintenance of order and in promoting honesty and industry among those of the lowest class who are our slaves. And our habitual vigilance renders standing armies, whether of soldiers or policemen, entirely unnecessary. Small guards in our cities and occasional patrols in the country ensure us a repose and security known nowhere else.
That sounds terrifying.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah, it does.
terrifying.
Right. And what happened was South Carolina relied on the slave codes that came from Barbados. There were a lot of people of color, a lot of slaves in Barbados who were working on the plantations, and very few slave masters, white people who were running them. And so they were afraid because there was a few of them and a whole lot of people who were
Yeah.
working for them. And they had enslaved human beings who were not wanting to be enslaved, as human beings don't generally want to be enslaved. And so they had to come up with some slave codes and some standards of policing in Barbados. So, it wouldn't get taken over by the people who were actually doing all of the work. And there are people from Barbados who went to South Carolina and they brought that fear. Another quote from this says that white people in the South, and particularly in South Carolina, lived in a crisis of fear, spurred even by the rumors of rebellions from those whom they enslaved. So it wasn't just, it was a real fear for slave owners of like, these people might kill us in our sleep. That's real. Also, it's your own fault. Don't enslave people if you don't want them to come and kill you. The slave patrols in Barbados and in America and South Carolina, sometimes they were the formerly enslaved who are working as slave catchers because they wanted to win their freedom. They wanted to stay free. They wanted to stay on the good side. That's complicated. There were paid slave catchers. There were militias. And so it ended up that the private slave patrols were ineffective. Somebody just going and hiring some people and being like, go get my slaves. It didn't work so well. And so the enslavers actually unified and passed a law that made this a responsibility borne by all whites. They said, hey, all white people, we know not all of you have slaves, but this is your responsibility as well to catch these Black slaves that we have. So join with us because we made a law. Now you have to. And this became social action when private industry failed. All the whites were required to whip and detain the enslaved until their master could arrive to retrieve them. So it was private police force no more. All the white people organized together as a community with collective action to become a unified police force.
Is that a well-regulated militia?
I guess. I don't want that.
There's a couple things about what you mentioned about the slave patrols and the way that even sometimes men of color were deputized.
Hmm.
That was also true in the urban North. So the city of Boston copied the London Metropolitan Police. That was formed in 1829 by Sir Robert Peel. And because Sir Robert Peel's nickname was Bobby, the police were called Bobbies. But Sir Robert Peel had managed the British colonial occupation of Ireland. And there were these British landowners whose interest that he was protecting. And so there was that emphasis. Now, in the States, this contributes to why private security and also public police forces were used to break strikes. They were anti-labor. There were also places where Irish, Italian, German, or other European immigrants who were non-Western European were kind of incorporated into the dominant kind of white power structure, even though
Right.
they were kind of half in, half out.
Right.
But I want to contrast all this with just like one principle that's in Jewish law in Exodus 22 about property theft and to what extent can you defend yourself? Again, in Israel, as background, God placed a restorative justice paradigm in Jewish law to promote shalom, well-being, human flourishing, because in the biblical story, God made Israel to be kind of a partial restoration of humanity in a garden land. They were supposed to be an Adam and Eve. Of course, there's sin in the world. Human beings have a corrupted human nature. So people did things like break in. So this is one of the laws that address that. Here's Exodus 22, verse 2. If a thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. So at face value, that seems to justify lethal violence in self-defense. But it just so happens that that's only half of the law. We have to quote the whole thing. The second half of it is in verse 3. But if it happens in daylight, the one who killed the thief is guilty of murder. That law puts a limitation on like how far you can defend yourself. Now, the law already calls the guy a thief. The assumption here is that this person's breaking into a tent or a house or something to steal something. And if it's nighttime and you don't know what the person's doing, or you don't know who it is or what their intention is, then it's okay to use lethal force. But if it's daylight, you can't.
Hmm.
So the castle doctrine, the idea that your home is your castle and you could defend it no matter what, that is very popular in America. I don't see that here. I see some responsibility to use discernment. So during the daytime, you could presumably see that the person is unarmed or is running away. The person is named as a thief, so there must have been some way to tell that they just wanted to steal. Now, given that, on this principle, you don't have an unlimited right to defend your property. And this shows the values of God. So it shows it in the negative scenario. It also shows what we've been calling God's Jubilee economy, the larger vision, the positive vision. God prioritizes people over property, even in the scenario where someone is breaking and entering, right? People are still more valuable than property. And in the case law about this negative situation, it reinforces the bigger picture, which is this: God gifts the garden land to his people, and then to Israel, he regifts the garden land in the Jubilee year to his people. And then in Jesus, he regifts the garden planet to humanity. We inherit it if we share with others the way Jesus shares with us, because that means we're participating with Christ, in Christ. So people are more valuable than property, including when a person is stealing your property, like in that very moment. Now, assuming that you can discern, this is where the duty to retreat is more consistent with the original sense of Exodus 22, verses 2 and 3, and then how Jesus does two things to Jewish law, which we've been pointing out. Jesus widens the scope of God's love to include the Gentiles as co-heirs with Israel. That's Ephesians 3, for example. And Jesus claims not just the land of Israel as his to administer and share, but the whole earth, like the whole planet. So that does two things, ethically and morally. Jesus makes all humans equal with each other, and then he further lowers property rights, or the significance of property claims, down a notch more, because you can't directly claim your land or home. Jesus claims it first. Jesus claims it before you. Jesus claims everything everywhere. So that's what it means to participate in Jesus's vision and response to all these situations. So if you can retreat, you do have a duty to do so. If you can de-escalate the situation to the extent that these are, you have time to think through these things. Now, should thieves be caught and be held accountable? Yeah, absolutely. In what framework? In a restorative justice framework, not a retributive justice framework, right? A restorative justice framework is one where the victim's voice is centered, and the thief might even have to repay more than what they stole. So that's what we see in Exodus 22, and we covered that in the third video of our series on plantation capitalism versus Jesus' Jubilee Economy. One of the relationships that we're covering is thieves and their victims. But the Castle Doctrine says that, at least in some of its extreme forms, it says that if someone comes into your house or your property, you have no duty to discern, at least in some interpretations of that law, right? And then the stand your ground law says that where you are, wherever you are, it is your castle, right? Like you have a right to be there, except if you're on someone else's property. But the extremes of the Castle Doctrine and the stand your ground laws come from a bad biblical interpretation. And this is where we have to discuss it on another level, on an explicitly Christian ethics level, a church history level. Where does this bad biblical interpretation come from? Well, at least in England in the 18th century, there was a different translation and interpretation of Exodus 22, verses 2 and 3. This translation gives the appearance that God takes away any duty to discern, any duty to retreat, or duty to exercise restraint in the use of force to defend your home. This English translation reads, "If a thief is caught breaking in and is struck so that he dies, the thief owes no blood debt to the home defender," meaning the thief already paid with his life. He owed a blood debt and he paid it. But if the thief lives, he owes a blood debt to the home defender and must make restitution. I argue that this makes absolutely no sense. Why not? Two reasons. First of all, because where did the language go of nighttime versus daytime? Where is the duty to discern based on what you can see? It's just not there. This interpretation is very strange by eliminating that. Second of all, because this interpretation doesn't match the other consequences for theft. Throughout Exodus 21 and 22, we see the other consequences given for other types of theft. So the restitution that a thief of property owes is 2 to 5 times the value of what he or she stole. That's Exodus 22, verses 1 through 14. The restitution that a thief of bodily health owes, right? Like if basically I physically injure someone, I can be thought of as a thief of their bodily health, and I owe full compensation for their loss of time and bodily function. And if it's my ebed servant, which we covered before, that's the Hebrew indentured servant, not a chattel slave, but if it's an indentured servant, and if I injure this servant bodily, then I owe him his or her freedom. I owe him release, because it would correct the power dynamic and prevent that from happening again, at least in that context. So it makes no sense to say a thief owes a blood debt to the home defender just because they trespassed. A blood debt refers to his own life. It's as if the thief committed murder just by trespassing. In Exodus 21, verses 15 and 16, a kidnapper or enslaver, meaning a thief of men or women, like actual people, they owe a blood debt because that's the equivalent of stealing a life and treating people as not human. So coming back to Exodus 22, verses 2 and 3, in this bizarre English translation, it was somehow popular in England in the 18th century, but it's totally wrong. It gives the appearance that you can defend your home from intruders at all costs, right? Without any discernment, but it's wrong. Now, who used this wrong translation? There was a commentator named Matthew Henry. He used it. He was a famous British Presbyterian minister and a commentator on scripture. His commentaries are featured on websites for free, made available for free. So he's pretty widely read. Now, what was happening in England that this mistranslation became so popular? It was theories of colonialism, theories that justified it, theories of private property, like the private property absolutism of John Locke. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. Unfortunately, this is another one of the influences of Christian mistakes, even perhaps Christian heresy, that passed from England to the United States. And so let me spell it out in simple terms. The Castle Doctrine and the Stand Your Ground laws, they come out of Christian mistakes. They come out of bad, irresponsible translations of Exodus 22, verses 2 and 3. In particular, it is more appropriate to say, on the basis of going from Jewish law to Jesus's teaching, that we have a duty to discern, and yes, a duty to retreat in situations where we can, especially when confronting a thief, where that confrontation might lead to more violence or even death. There are more ways to catch a thief. There are more ways to prevent theft. So that would totally influence gun culture. I mean, I've had friends move up from Virginia, North and South Carolina, because they felt unsafe. I mean,
Yeah.
they're Black, they're, stopping at a gas station and they see
Mhm.
people open carrying, and
Oh, yeah.
it feels, I know there are different ways to interpret all that, but it just feels a little bit unsafe. Uh,
Mhm. Mhm.
and especially with stand your ground laws, like
Mm.
stand your ground against what exactly, and how big of a threat do you have to be standing up against?
Right. Right. To say nothing of the fact that if you're somebody who is marginalized, then the sight of you open carrying is not met with applause or feelings of safety from those around you.
Right, right,
Can think about like the Black Panthers. They started open carrying guns to defend themselves and their communities, as is their Second Amendment right. Right.
right,
But then, Reagan and the NRA were like, hold on, not like that. That's not what we meant.
right,
And
right.
so they said, let's be reasonable. Let's all agree that we don't really need to carry guns openly.
Yeah, which is just kind of funny and shocking, but not funny and shocking. And
Mm,
I get that there were other things around the nation that made it so, like, people were considering limitations on open carry. So it wasn't just the Black Panthers.
mhm.
And there was an article at Duke University which talked about that. But I would say part of what was happening in the public consciousness was fear of race riots.
Mm,
And the
mhm,
reason why race riots were happening was because of urban unrest, because of over policing in Black communities,
mhm,
injustice, like unfair treatment, people getting beat up or murdered by cops,
mhm,
or that the cops were only protecting property rights.
mhm.
And
Right.
so these race riots weren't happening because of no reason. And in the popular imagination, I think that people think it was only Black people rioting. In reality, there were a lot of white people rioting too. But in any case, yes, the NRA and Reagan said in response, like, "Whoa, reasonable people don't have to open carry." I mean,
Mhm.
that's amazing.
Right.
Times have changed. Do you think the U.S. perpetuates a culture of violence and fear because of property?
I don't know about you, but I went and saw a movie recently and I thought about someone shooting up the movie theater.
Mm,
I'm afraid of violence for
mhm,
sure. As a therapist, I work to help other people with exactly that same kind of fear, who have
mm,
the fear of being in public places. And, you can think of any number of violent incidents that in any number of places that you might go where it might happen. And yes, I think we have a culture of fear.
yeah. And why do we think guns are the answer to that, right? Like, I think the question John Stewart recently asked was, when will we be safe? Like, how, we now have more guns than people, like about
Hmm.
400 million guns. We have only 330 million people. That that
Hmm.
includes babies, right? So
Right.
when will we be safe? Like, what level of gun ownership uh,
Right.
will make us safe? I'm for gun responsibility, and I can see different permutations of laws that I think could be okay.
Hmm.
But it is worrisome that gun purchases totally went up during COVID.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it's like a response to a big government program, like, hey, we need to do this for public health's sake. And then somehow something kicks into people where they fear the government is going to come for them, for their guns, and I guess for their wealth. I mean, I think that this is why not all, but some violence is motivated by the kind of great replacement theory that white
Mm.
people have of we're going to be replaced, and it was touted by Tucker Carlson and others. It motivated the Buffalo shooting and the supermarket
Mhm,
and a bunch of
mhm.
others. So,
I think of this in terms of what's already happened in this country.
mm,
White people came here and killed everybody who were not white. They are the great replacement. That's what happened.
mm,
The reason why you're going outside and you need to wear a whole bunch of sunscreen just to exist out in the sunshine is because you're not meant to be here in this much sunshine. You are the great replacement. And so, of course, you have to you live in a place where you're not you didn't come from. Neither did I. To be fair, I don't come from here either,
right.
but British colonists came here, and others, Dutch and Spanish as well, they came here and replaced all the people. So a great replacement is something that happened, but not in the way that
So
it's
accusation is confession. That's what you're saying.
perhaps perhaps.
I mean, this is why I think people are fascinated by movies like Independence Day, right? The aliens
Mm.
come to planet Earth and take our
Mhm,
water. It's because that's what happened, right? Colonists
mhm,
took resources
mhm,
by force, by violence.
mhm, mhm, mhm. And it's, as someone who is British, I love England. I love England. I love going to England. I would go there more frequently if I could figure out how to do it. But it kind of sucks. You can't walk anywhere without it being slippery and slimy because everything's sort of mildewy because it's all rainy and cloudy. And there's some good cream and stuff, but it doesn't. They went to other countries and took all of their spices and jewels because they didn't have any. That stuff isn't in England.
Right,
They were like,
right.
"Oh, it's good over here. Look at all the jewels that they're in. Can I get some of those?" And they took all their food and spices. So
Mm,
yeah, they went. It's more than a great replacement. It's violent so you can have other people's stuff.
mm, yeah, yeah. I think it's really important to notice, like, Israel could not become an empire because, first of all, God said it's these lands and don't go beyond that. As Jesus takes his Jewish inheritance and goes further with it, right? He's saying, look, I want to incorporate foreigners, the outsider. I want to reach other people, and we have to treat them with respect. So there are passages that in the Old Testament that talk about the messianic king from the house of David and how he will rule over the nations. Now that sounds violent, and some people during the Middle Ages took that to be a sanction for violence. But that was wrong, because Jesus himself showed he didn't interpret it violently. I think it's really important to notice in Jesus's Jubilee Economy, he is challenging people and even institutions to be respectful of the imago Dei, like the image of God, in which God created all people. In Luke 3:14, I know we touched on this in one of our first videos, but this is where people are coming to John the Baptist saying, we've heard about this kingdom of God. How do we repent? And one of those groups were imperial soldiers. And John the Baptist tells the soldiers, as pre-Christians or even as non-Christians, right? Because Jesus hadn't even started his public ministry. But John the Baptist says, don't extort the public. And the inference is, even if your commanding officer tells you to, right? In other words, you are being reduced to your public good, common good function of just respect people, keep order, and be fair. Stop using your power to additionally extort people, right? Like your ability to use violence to profit further from it.
Right.
So the impact of Jesus's kingdom, his Jubilee economy, is to build a public good, common good. Talking about the legal use of force that a community decides on together is really important. The escalation of force has to be really, really cautious and thoughtful. And the many instances of people running away from police, but police shooting them in the back, just how egregious that is.
Right. Absolutely. In the UK, police are not routinely armed with guns. They have a baton and they have tasers. In Northern Ireland, all police carry firearms, whereas in the rest of the United Kingdom, firearms are carried only by specially trained firearms officers. So you've got something, but you can't just murder people with it. We're not going to give you something where you could easily murder someone with it. You can subdue them. And so, right. And so a taser is a great, it's an invention to take somebody down and, take them in front of a judge and have justice be done.
Another example in the Bible, which is not commonly brought up, is how Jewish law has never authorized judicial torture. So judicial torture is something that, it sounds horrible, doesn't it? Like,
yeah, it sounds really bad. I don't want that.
Yeah, but it was common in the ancient world, and it persisted into medieval times, despite some of the Christian influence. It kind of escaped notice, but the idea was that, especially for, guess what, slaves, they don't tell the truth, but so you have to apply torture to them if you ever have them as a witness in court, even if they are telling the truth.
Just go ahead and torture people just because of who they are, because they're not going to tell the truth. So I'm like, hello. And they're like, time for torture. And you're like, well, I'll tell you the truth. They're like, no, you won't until I torture you.
Exactly. Because of course that works, right? When you apply torture to someone in court.
Preemptively. Just go ahead and do it preemptively.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
And yet that was common. But Jewish law absolutely forbade it. This is what Warren Goldstein says in his book. Judicial torture of an accused would serve no purpose in Jewish law, because even voluntary confessions are inadmissible as evidence because of the two eyewitness requirement of Deuteronomy 17:16, 19:15 as well. Jewish law's rejection of judicial torture is unique in Western civilization, probably Eastern civilization too, especially because it's so ancient. The law against self-incrimination relates to the accused person's vulnerability. They're already vulnerable if they're brought into trial. This criminal law paradigm is based on the biblical verse from Numbers 35:25, and the congregation will save, which, according to the Talmud, this verse establishes a principle in terms of which one of the key responsibilities of any criminal court is to protect the interests of an accused person by finding legally acceptable ways to save him from conviction.
I mean, that has so many benefits to society. it saves society from just being jerks at each other. I mean, that's an important thing. It saves
Just a little. Yes.
just a little bit. It saves you from just don't be a jerk. Like there's that principle there, whatever that is. But then there's also, you can go to court and you can, someone can accuse you of something and you don't have to be like, great, now that I've gotten accused, this is going to be terrible, I need to go ahead and run, which would make you look guilty anyway. Like you can have confidence that the legal system is going to protect you if you are innocent, and you could stand there and confidently defend yourself. So it's not just not being a jerk, it's actually taking care of each other as you would want to be taking care of yourself.
That's right. That's right. And, having a public defendant is really important. But,
Right.
like arguably plea bargaining undermines this principle, right? Where
Yeah.
it's a form of psychological judicial torture. Like,
Yeah.
well, I'll let you off with the lesser crime of possession of marijuana or, something like that, as opposed to possession of a harder drug or the trafficking of a harder drug.
Right.
Um,
Right.
because, then you can actually get a trial by your peers. Imagine that. Like
Right.
you can demand that you get a trial by your peers. But if you agree to a plea bargain, you don't get a trial by your peers, but you get a lesser sentence for sure.
And that sucks if you're innocent.
Right.
You've done nothing wrong, and it undermines confidence in the legal system entirely. If you would have to sit there if you were accused and do all of these mental gymnastics to decide, okay, I'm going to plea bargain down, but then what if I get a job, and what if someone does a background check and then they see that I had to plea bargain this, and then I only served time for that, and then I have to be like, actually I was innocent, but then I this, and so no one can trust the legal system at that point because it's incredibly inefficient, and you have to plea bargain people down because there's not enough time for trials to everybody. It's a mess. And that brings us back to the concept of applying Christian ethics to the public square. Then we're talking about everybody together. Everybody who comes into the public square deserves good. Well, we are out of time for today, but join us next time for session 7 when we talk about the powerful versus the rest of society.